From the very first moments of Gunslinger Girl, one is struck with the sense that they are about to see something completely different. You are going to see some weaponized anime girls shooting guns, as advertised on the wrapper, but there is a singular sense of place and tone. Existential ennui in an overcast Italy. The Light Before We Land, the opening of the first anime adaptation, does a particularly good job of establishing this, but this is no less a feature of every incarnation of the series. So today we are going to talk about all of them. The manga, the two takes on the anime, and more. The 2003 Madhouse anime is by far the most common port of entry to Gunslinger Girl, and the most photogenic. Italy is in the grips of a low-intensity civil war. Left-wing radicals are rising to overthrow the government. Fascist dead-enders smell blood in the water and are trying to do the same. This isn't anime, this is just Italy in the 1960s and 70s. All GSG does is drag that conflict, the so-called Years of Lead, out into the 21st century, with right-wing separatists in the north being the primary belligerents. To combat this rising tide of extremism and the corruption inside the security apparatus, the Berlusconi government founds a new security agency composed of trustworthy veterans of other services, the euphemistically named Social Welfare Agency. They are tasked with hunting the terrorists and their fellow travelers extra-legally and with extreme prejudice. Pretty potent stuff, but to take it an extra mile into grim territory, they use Italy's famed super science to create the cyborgs. Produced by taking terminally ill little girls, for the process only works on tweenage girls, brainwashing them and replacing most of their body with super strong artificial muscles and reinforced bones. They would be more accurately described as bio-cyborgs, with nothing electronic in their construction. But the result is the same, as these dubious little creatures are fast, know no fear, can tank low-velocity rounds, and snap men's spines like breadsticks. They are inarguably superhuman, but inevitably tragic, as like Italian cars, their high performance comes at the cost of a short lifespan. These walking weapons are paired with the experienced agents of the Social Welfare Agency to create units called fratello, or siblings. The girls are mentally conditioned to protect and obey their partner, but they form genuine, if suspect, emotional attachments as well. It's implied that drugs and brain stimulation don't achieve much that affection or abuse cannot. The girls are hardly perfectly obedient Manchurian candidates. So one of the biggest narrative questions of the show is where brainwashing ends and where loyalty begins. This central thrust is best carried by the two Croce brothers, Jean and Jose, former carabinieri who each pair with a cyborg. Jose dotes on Henrietta like a beloved little sister, spending free time with her and plying her with gifts, turning every mission into an adventure with prizes. Henrietta lives for this treatment and reciprocates in a dangerously unstable manner, possessive clinginess being rather troubling from a bulletproof cyborg who can crush bones with their grip strength. Jean, by contrast, trains and disciplines Rico as a military subordinate, an unerring assistant in a personal war on terror. This makes Rico a mercilessly effective little soldier, though she smiles before shooting, grateful as she is to be free of quadriplegia and a hospital bed. She is even unfazed when Jean applies corporal punishment. But if you have gathered that despite it all, Jean is the more sane, less creepy brother, I'm sure you'll score well when we get to the test. Rico and Henrietta are joined by the perpetually ailing Angelica, first of the cyborgs, and Marco, her punished handler. Then there are the apparent elders of the group, with Clays, resident guinea pig, and Triella, the big sister, who will be quite prominent later. Characters like these carry us into some excellent sequences of intrigue and action. Most episodes consist of a long, moody build to a short, sharp gunfight. One is given many chances to settle into our characters and the aesthetics of the big boot, but time is spared to flesh out who the bad guys of the week are and why the girls are about to turn them into worm food. Context is the central pillar for Gunslinger Girl, as load-bearing as a Tarantino fanboy's one black friend. It's tough to get across how big of a difference it makes that the series has a real setting with a real conflict going on. Our heroes are soldiers and spooks in a dubiously legal black operation, and the antagonists are terrorists, not the post-2001 scare word, but dumbass kids and pitiful dead-enders trying to kill their way to the promised land. Some are idealists, some are angry, many are just along for the ride in an endlessly tumbling cycle of violence. To the extent the multiple political factions have a unifying theme, it is anti-globalism, which was an astute observation for a foreign writer before the great financial crisis. The right-wing types are trying to secede from the effete elites in Rome. The left-wing types want to destroy the bourgeois tyranny of the European Union. In the blinding Mediterranean sunlight, it all feels at least a little palpable and believable, even when there are little girls cracking necks. As much as the setting carries things, I don't want to underrate how good Ida Yu's action setups are, or how effectively Madhouse brought them to life. To me, the shootouts managed to toe the line of being grounded, but also showing off that we have superhuman badasses in the ring. Without a lot of explanation, you can figure out what the cyborg's powers and limitations are naturally. Though other anime set people's expectations rather poorly, so perhaps it's lost on some audiences that shooting a handgun effectively from a full sprint is a feat beyond mere mortals. Most action scenes are assaults or ambushes, which establish a distinct location and a set number of hostiles in advance. No infinitely respawning battalions of baddies. So every kill feels unique and punchy. Kind of like how Gunslinger Girl feels so unique and punchy in the world of anime. I don't want to make it sound like the series is just something you come to for desperate lack of options, like a Cracker Barrel in rural America. But there just aren't many other things you can watch if you want to see some sort of grounded gunfight action in animation, with this much care put into the set dressing. Girls with Guns is one of the canonical anime subgenres. It had a particularly prolific era, bracketed by the Gunsmith Cats OVA in '96 and Kanon in '09, largely defined by the works of Studio B-Train, but it continues on to this day. In discussion of these series, one does see occasional reference and comparison to Gunslinger Girl, particularly for the recent Lycoris Recoil, since it has a nominally similar premise of a secret security service. But to me, this is as if people insisted upon a guys with swords genre in which both Berserk and Sword Art Online were members. It's not as if Noir or Madlax or Phantom are terrible anime. Even if B-Train never really figured out how to animate a gunfight beyond literal shot reverse shot, they display the nerdy hyperfixations of their creators, set in European locales loaded with historical trivia. This kind of obvious passion will endear me to any anime, as it does for Gunslinger Girl. But the plot always forces the viewer to suspend their disbelief inside a cliché-filled void. The evil society is planning to take over the world, and the walking MacGuffin is the key to everything. It's the premise of the anime within an anime the Chuni character likes, or found in the back of a Manga for Dummies book. People engage in long conversations in the middle of gunfights. An endless stream of mooks stand gormlessly in the open for our heroes to mow down. Snore. I gather the reason most of these shows maintain a fan base is because they are more homoerotic than a married E7, which I completely respect, but I do not come here for the Yuri. What I came for is a firearms safety class, or metrosexual scarf man's description of an anarchist's kooky politics, or the way this guy's neck snaps, the understated echoing pop of distant gunfire. Gunslinger Girl is set in a real place with real stakes and social dynamics, not a game of cops and robbers. The assault on the hideout in episode 7 demonstrates what kind of stone-cold killers each of the main girls are. Episode 5 shows us what happens when the agency tries to recruit guys who aren't emotionally committed to some kind of vengeance. It has been said that the emotional distance displayed by the characters is what betrays that this was a foreigner's impression of Italy. But I'd like to think that it serves to show how fighting in this conflict has sent everyone east of Eden. All my favorite fiction is that which crosses an enthusiasm for hardware or technical details with some strong emotional grounding, anchoring a dramatic story in some version of reality. Gunslinger Girl delivers. I mean, Rico leaves the safety on, cleans a barrel from the breech, and everyone wonders why Clays can't hit everything after they gave her a turd for a handgun. But this series is an artifact of an era when the only reference footage for guns were these sizzle reels with elevator music. At some point, I find getting worked up over military hardware is just tedious. Even the most detailed gun wank media creates nothing but an idealized simulacrum of a firearm, which fails to capture the true realities. The way shooting leaves a layer of black grime on your hands, the way you can just fail to seat a magazine, or how the CZ-75 is a bratty pistol in need of correction, and you can run the slide by giving it a solid smack. The technical details that Gunslinger Girl really nails are more institutional in nature. This is hardly a primary source level Jean Le Carre spy story, but it achieves some level of verisimilitude. The Social Welfare Agency doesn't feel like a social club for cool dudes who fight terrorists. It is a clandestine organization with a chain of command and all the associated political baggage. Considerable effort is spent pleasing political sponsors as opposed to pursuing the actual mission. The whole Elsa debacle is a great example of what those in the business would refer to as blamestorming. The series does have a rather romantic conception of its special operatives as cultured Renaissance men who train their charges to be warrior poets, and I find that quite attractive, though I'm sure the reality of security work would disappoint. Nowadays, anime fans have come to expect that adaptations of manga be straight and complete, intended to act as a direct advertisement or companion to the source material. But in the 2000s, when anime was more often intended as a distinct money-making enterprise, it was common for anime adaptations to either have additional anime original content, or more cuts than my high school girlfriends. Madhouse's Gunslinger Girl is an interesting example of the former, with 2 episodes being almost entirely anime original, and generally shaping things to make the anime a more independently complete story. Episode 9 contributes one of the series' more fun action scenes, and adds a front half to an arc that before consisted entirely of denouement. I've seen people complain that this makes one of the twists a little too obvious, but I wouldn't argue it was much of a mystery in the first place, since the manga really provided no clues for the audience to go on. Episode 12 is a completely anime original episode, and acts as the series' climax. In the moment, though, it feels natural because the creators clearly understood what made the source material tick. It starts with the Cyborg program coming under political pressure to show some results, and the brass cooking up a harebrained operation to justify their existence, using Clays as a decoy to capture some kidnappers. Then the agency completely cocks it up and actually loses track of her, with the operation only being saved by happenstance and mercy. The final assault on the mountainside villa abides by all the same rules as other action sequences in the series to great effect, establishing a sensible location and a limited number of hostiles, and then cooking it off with one of the most bombastic action sequences in the entire series. I think it's the high point of the anime, but astute manga readers will notice it wrinkles one's impression of several of the characters, in particular the way it continues a trend of Marco being way more of a cold asshole than he was in the manga. The final episode, though it is directly based on a chapter of the manga, reframes the final scene to imply that a character dies, serving as a more powerful ending. I'm not sure to what degree this was fabricated from whole cloth as opposed to front-running the manga, since Madhouse was making this adaptation extremely early in the manga's run, with barely 11 chapters to go on out of the ultimate 101. It doesn't end up being a very compelling ending unless you're into tragedy, but I think it was necessary for Madhouse to try, because without it, these chapters just serve as a lot of setup with no real payoff. All this finagling around explains the reports that the original mangaka, Ida Yu, disliked the first anime, though I haven't been able to corroborate that claim beyond him vaguely snubbing it in interviews and presentations. Repeatedly, his only address of the show is thanking Madhouse for doing the best with little material, which sounds more than a little backhanded. If you have translated interviews to greater effect, I would love to see them in the comments. But in a way, it's easy to see how the original creator could find the Madhouse series somewhat threatening. An adaptation this striking is going to reshape how people see the work, and if the author feels like it's pulling in the wrong direction, I can imagine that would be extremely painful. An opening song and video like this is just the type of artistic statement there's no going back from. Criminally underrated Scottish indie act, the Delgados, is an indelible part of how people remember Gunslinger Girl, now and forever. Their album Hate, which is itself opened by The Light Before We Land, is peak sad boy music, and you should go listen to it now. Ida's disappointment would not last forever, though, as this was not the only chance he would get to bring his work to animation, for better or for worse. Gunslinger Girl Season 2, Il Teatrino, released in 2008, is most certainly a change of direction. Ida assumed more direct creative control, and there is a new brace of staff, the baton having been passed from the venerable studio Madhouse to the considerably less acclaimed studio Artland. You could say Artland was hot off the production of the classic Mushishi, but the leading staff of Il Teatrino were not credited on Mushishi, nor much of anything else notable. The plot diversions of the first season are understandably ignored, Angie still being alive and all, though I'm sure some audiences found this confusing. But what I think really defined the reputation of this series is the shift in art style and the rough production of the opening episodes. The show doesn't even begin with a properly animated intro. It's a perfectly pleasant song, which suits the tone of Gunslinger Girl, but the video makes a bad first impression, being just a montage of filtered reference videos. That's only endearing when Gainax does it. Then the first episode tries to imply a riot by shaking a series of blurred stills with terrible audio effects. Followed by a series of roughly put together action scenes. I imagine this is where many fans of the first season dropped the series altogether, consigning it to the ignoble club of anime sequels that buck survivorship bias to have lower MAL scores than their predecessor. Even if the production does find some footing by episode 2 or 3, there is no getting around the moment-to-moment experience of the series. The sound design continues to be poor, the music generic and unfitting, there's some questionable voice direction, and then there's just how it looks. After the well-shaded character art and exquisite backgrounds of the Madhouse series, this flat pastel look that could be any other cheap late 2000s anime is easy to see as a letdown. I don't like it much myself, but I will be the devil's advocate for a moment. The art of Il Teatrino is undeniably mediocre, the style forgettable. But after rewatching both shows, it feels like less of a downgrade in the production department than I remembered. For all the lovely-looking clips of Madhouse Gunslinger Girl that spring to mind and I can put in my edit, it's hard to deny that the show doesn't sometimes look goofy. The action cuts and close-ups usually look good, way better than Il Teatrino ever does, but it was marred with bad crowd shots, the blurriness of early digital anime, and characters going off-model. Even front and center, the character art just looks weird and dated. The girls could host a billboard on the bridge of their nose. The guys all look like yaoi fan art of Fullmetal Alchemist. And when it comes to rough starts, everyone seems to forget the repetition in the first episodes. Il Teatrino isn't that much worse in the jank and inconsistency department, and I could see why the mangaka would be happier with how it looks like his art. If you treat the color covers of the manga volumes as the definitive visual model of the series, Artland usually landed a little closer. Ultimately, the Madhouse anime is on the whole many times better looking and more watchable, but this show goes to show how there's a fine line where the audience goes from being invested and unbothered by momentary roughness to cringing at all of the crap. Presentation aside, however, Il Teatrino is more Gunslinger Girl. Woe betide the workaday terrorist who did not expect to be torn apart by an attack cyborg today. Henrietta's a psycho, Clays is alone on this barren earth, Rico is vibing, Angie is a little piss baby, and Triella is the cool one. Triella, the dark-skinned Twin Tails blonde, gets top billing in Il Teatrino, and it's easy to see why. She's the dorm mom among the girls and seems considerably more independent and human. Her relationship with her handler Hirscher, former German policeman, is affectionate but comparatively healthy. While Rico and Henrietta alternately act like killer robots or flighty little girls, Triella is a young woman, and a sharp, trilingual, cultured badass at that. Every character in Gunslinger Girl has a tragic past, and the girls all live on borrowed time. But Triella is the first to really make one feel the tragedy of her future, the lack thereof. She's a veritable Roy Batty. She's a prodigy meant for greater things, yet all she can do with the scant years she has left is stack bodies in the dark. What a waste. So what's not a waste is for Triella to essentially be the main character of Il Teatrino, leading what I guess should be called the Pinocchio arc. One of the manga's few recognizable arcs, it contains the whole action anime cursus honorum, with an escalating series of fights, setbacks for our heroes, and a training arc. But most importantly, there's a fleshed out cast of villains. One would already be familiar with Franca and Franco, the Bonnie and Clyde demolition duo. Franca is a true believer, out to topple a government she feels was corrupt in imprisoning her father. She doesn't kill unnecessarily, just plants bombs to send a message. In her introductory episode, she unknowingly bumps into Henrietta and Jose, fresh out of killing her erstwhile clients, and Franca comments that this apparent upper-class rich girl, with perfume and nice clothes and an expensive violin case, is all that is good and right with the world, and who she is looking to benefit by her actions. The immediate irony is glaring, but it also demonstrates that even so far as Franca is sympathetic, she is also naive and you could say politically short-sighted. That said, her partner, though not boyfriend, Franco, apparently finds her sufficiently inspiring. He's an expert bomb maker and operative who lost his will to fight on until Franca dragged him out of hiding to be her weapon. They are joined by Pinocchio, on whom the story hinges. An orphan boy pulled from the gutter to be an assassin for Padania. He was trained by an ex-CIA assassin, kind of leaning on Operation Gladio conspiracy theories. And he killed a little girl on his first assignment, which continues to haunt him. An exceptionally efficient killer with knives and his wits, he lives only for the approval of Cristiano, head of the Milan group of Padania, the northern right-wing separatist movement. Between Franca, Franco, and Pinocchio, we have the two main types of people that fight in all the terrorist conflicts of Gunslinger Girl. Idealists with a vengeance, and young people essentially born into the conflict who fight out of loyalty to parental figures. It is no coincidence that this easily maps onto those of the Social Welfare Agency as well. Whatever moral equivalencies you may or may not want to draw, the practical reality of civil war is that both sides contain very similar sorts of people. A cycle of violence driven by revenge, with the organizations and ideologies being little but set dressing. The crux of the arc is often what ends up stretching people's suspension of disbelief. At their first meeting, Pinocchio gets the drop on Triella and knocks her out, though he cannot finish the job due to his memory of his first mission. Triella is mortified that she lost to a mere mortal and cannot face Hirscher, while Pino has similarly disappointed by not going in for the kill. The drawings do a reasonably good job of explaining how this upset could happen. Pinocchio clearly uses his superior skills to slip Triella's guard. He doesn't overpower. In training later, it's explained that the cyborgs might have incredible reflexes, but that doesn't overcome a lack of combat experience and training. But Pinocchio is just a kid, and it's hard to shake the sense that a super-fast combat cyborg that can one-rep max a car should instantly send anyone within reach to a closed-casket funeral. Which is not what happens when daddy issues bring the two to their final rematch. It ends up being a protracted affair where Triella is carried by her superhuman durability. The manga goes on to make a better case, but at this point it's hard to argue with the sort of people who question, why do they have to be little girls, and how are the cyborgs even useful? The Pinocchio arc is broken up with various one-off episodes. The Crochet brothers find that old friends have gone over to the other side and need to be put out to pasture. We see how Clays deals with her confinement, and Marco watches with horror as Angelica continues to mentally decline. He can't come to terms with the fact that the little girl they all raised has been taken away by the drugs and surgeries. Not only did the reconditioning erase her memories, but all the cyborgs will eventually suffer from early onset dementia, the treatment being too much for the human brain to handle. The social welfare agency has sacrificed, or you could say destroyed, a lot, and it's only going to get worse from here. Now, the real question is, should you watch El Teatrino for this content instead of reading the manga, seeing as it's pretty ugly and a straight adaptation? All I can say is that it's much easier for me to make a video about anime than a manga. The 13 episodes of Il Teatrino were expanded with a 2-episode OVA, vaguely anime original, but reconstituted from chapters of the manga. It mainly focuses on the Crochet brothers and their charges linking up to spend a bit of downtime together, but it foreshadows further events of the manga in 2 major ways. First, it proves my thesis that men only have 2 moods, styling on the Serbs and coping with loss catastrophically badly. The whole reason the 2 of them are here is because after they returned from a stint as peacekeepers in the Balkans, their entire extended family was assassinated just to get at their patriarch, who was a prosecutor. The loss which seems to hit them the hardest, though, was their shared little sister, Enrica. Jean, the more stable one, only has full-on conversations with her ghost at night. Jose is dressing up Henrietta in Enrica's old clothes. This is not a sustainable state of affairs, and the fraying mental state of the 2 handlers will be important as the story goes on. The other piece of foreshadowing is a landmark you could easily miss in the background of the Venice skyline. While we are on the topic of weird interstitial content, I would be remiss not to mention the video game appearances. After all, the most recent content in the franchise was the Girls Frontline crossover back in 2020. I want nothing to do with gacha games, but based on what I've seen, this seems like your typically anodyne gacha game tie-in content. Clearly, the developers were fans of the manga, but the dialogue comes out with nearly zero voice to it. The girls all speak the same and often nothing like the original characters. Back in the day, there were also the Japan-only PlayStation 2 games, light gun-style rail-shooting games, fairly basic stuff. They diverged from the plot by having a traitorous Fratello, reviews were middling, it's a tie-in game. Hard to say more about them since they haven't been translated. But what I find funny about it is the way they adhere closely to the aesthetics of the Madhouse anime, even when it doesn't seem like the best look and soundtrack for an arcadey experience. But man, that Madhouse Gunslinger Girl aesthetic really hits different seeing it again after Il Teatrino. You know, I have a little ritual. Whenever I'm on the plane and we're coming in for a landing, particularly after dark, I'll put on a Delgado's track and just look out the window. I'll often think about Gunslinger Girl, and why the fuck I fell in love with the work of a creep.
For instance, I don't have to try.
What? Did you think this wasn't weird? This is a series about preteen girls being used as assassins and their love for Oni-chan. The very premise is, for lack of a better word, sussy. I guess you could say it's easy to miss, since there is little lascivious leering directed at the girls aside from some cover art and a blink and you'll miss it panty shot in the manga. But fundamentally, this is a story that romanticizes deep connections between little girls and adult men, and it's set in the home of the Catholic Church. Like the social welfare agency, the manga astutely maintains plausible deniability at all times, but we aren't in court here. I hope everything I've said so far in this review would establish all of the other reasons why someone would enjoy Gunslinger Girl, but there's no escaping the fact that someone, somewhere, is getting off on this. When I downloaded an old scanslation of the manga to reread it, there were some rather nasty surprises tucked in the fan art between chapters. They know their audience. Most damningly, searching in the right places will dig up some rather nasty erotic doujins that Ueda penned before Gunslinger Girl. There's a temptation to dismiss this simply based on context. Gunslinger Girl is not far off the international cut of Leon the Professional, a movie your dad probably watched in theaters. The manga and anime are far less graphic or fetishistic than, say, Jobless Reincarnation or Made in Abyss, and mainstream Western anime tastemakers are proud to speak of Bakemonogatari and the worst that doujinshi have to offer, but it simply cannot be allowed to pass without notice. Ueda is a creep. The best I can say for him is that he seems to have tended less creepy over the years. I haven't found any evidence that he continued to write doujinshi, at least not under the same name. His currently publishing manga, The Valiant Must Fall, has all the hallmarks of his interests: terrorism, superhumans teamed with soldiers, but the age and power dynamics have been softened somewhat, which makes it less weird. I guess I'd trust the man with a plotline, but not my daughter. On that note, now that I have thoroughly poisoned the well, let's talk about the Gunslinger Girl manga, how it evolves, and the spectacular way it wraps everything up.
Step inside. A better dream job you could never find.
Gunslinger Girl went to print in Dengeki Daio magazine, alongside Yotsuba To. Talk about contrast. It starts out a little rough and fan art looking, but by the middle of the run develops a distinctively clean art style, with sharp digital lines and traced hardware alongside screen tone shading. The anime adaptations cover only 30-odd chapters of the 101 which comprise the final run of the manga, and the pace shifts considerably after this point, with few chapters featuring straightforward terrorist hunts. There's a lot more time spent developing the characters and introducing some new ones. Depending on the chapter and my mood, Sandro and Petrushka are either my most or least favorite characters. Sandro is definitely a fresh face at the agency. He's a spy, not a soldier, adverse to bloodshed, but an excellent con man in Don Juan. Petrushka was a Belarusian ballerina who threw herself from the roof of an Italian hospital after a battle with leukemia. She is rebuilt into the second generation of agency cyborgs, not as strong, not as tightly conditioned, but expected to live as long as Deep Space Nine or Voyager, while Henrietta and Triella's cohort are already beginning to fade before the end of Enterprise. Perhaps more importantly, the second generation are all of older stock. Instead of candidates age 11 to 15, they are more like 16 to 20. Petrushka, who everyone just calls Petra, is 20, but that only makes it slightly less weird when Sandro sizes her up, makes her act as his arm candy, and the romantic tension could be laid on with a trowel. He brushes off her advances. The point is to grapple with the whole dichotomy between true love and brainwashing. But I don't think it's kosher to flirt with your formal subordinate who has been conditioned to shit her entire self if she calls you a rude word. However, this is what I referred to when I said that Ueda's writing generally gets less creepy as time goes on. We've stepped down from truly evil Discord moderator, competitive Smash player type shit to merely scummy local dealer who drives an STI and carries 3 more behavior. Progress of a kind. Despite my reservations, Sandro and Petra have chemistry, and chapters like a surprise team-up with Clays or a hunt for Sandro's missing master are definitely charming. They sell the human part of security work, not just guns and blades. But on a less fun front, the moment finally comes when Angelica shuffles off the mortal coil. It really is a heart-wrenching depiction of dementia in progress, always down and down and down. There are moments of clarity. She even remembers things she's not supposed to remember, like her time before the agency, the first stories Marco told her after her surgeries. But that only twists the knife for him, as Marco thought that Angie was gone forever. This hammers home that the clock is ticking for all of the first-generation cyborgs, and with it comes fear that every forgotten moment is a harbinger of the end. In the shadow of this creeping mortality, we get the imminent lethality of the incident in Venice. To me, this is really where latter-day Gunslinger Girl comes into its own, around chapter 60. Terrorists have taken over the St. Mark's Campanile with hostages and the intent of embarrassing the government. The Social Welfare Agency is tasked with assaulting the most defensible possible location without completely destroying this valuable landmark. It's all the makings of the best action sequences of the series so far, but cranked to 11. There's a long setup for who these gunmen are and what sort of trap they've laid, and everything slides into place once the bullets start flying. It's a vicious battle, with the Crochet brothers in command and treating the aging cyborgs as expendable, but the intensity of the fighting also starts to answer those questions as to why the child cyborg program made sense in the first place, the extent of their superhuman strength and durability. With the stakes being so high, we get to see some at their most badass. Triella kick-flipping away a RPG while rope climbing the tower has to be up there, but we also see some at their worst. Henrietta starts to falter, with PTSD from her bygone past resurfacing, and Jose, desperate to kill the enemy, finally reveals his true colors. No more Mr. Nice Guy. From now on, he'll be doing his best Big Boss impression alongside a Henrietta he has brainwashed to be a thoughtless drone, all in service of his shameless, murderous revenge. You see, this attack is being led by a recently resurfaced Giacomo Dante, the man who destroyed the Crochet family, and who the brothers have been looking to revenge themselves upon all this time. John is taking it better. It's difficult to make that man angrier than he already was, but Jose has been bottling this up for years, and now everyone has to suffer. So far, the agency has only fought against isolated cells of lightly armed punks and your occasional lone operators like Pinocchio. There hasn't even been anyone particularly important or ambitious aside from Cristiano. So Giacomo Dante, the final act villain, could seem like a bit of a contrivance, an overtly anime introduction. A hitherto unmentioned mastermind who pops up out of nowhere and is able to unify all of Italy's insurgent groups from across the political spectrum. A nihilist who believes in nothing but violence, suffering, and getting paid to inflict them. But he does fit inside the logic of Gunslinger Girl and what it is going for. From a historical point of view, it makes sense for these factions to form a coalition. Half of them are simply regional secessionists who have compatible goals, and there is precedent for political extremists believing that once they topple the government, it's their niche ideology which will inevitably rise from the ashes. Moreover, the series has belabored the point that politics takes a back seat to personal attachments and grudges once the cycle of violence has rolled on long enough. Giacomo is also just a fairly grounded villain. His plots are simple. He takes defensible locations, sets traps, and dares the government to dislodge him. He's not the Joker, playing 5D chess with a bottomless supply of moles and insider information. He barely knows what the Social Welfare Agency is, or who Jean and Jose are, even though they want revenge so bad it drives them crazy. For him, it was Tuesday. The biggest assumptions Giacomo makes with his plans is that a lot of people in government want him dead, and nothing on two legs will withstand a 20mm anti-materiel rifle. Big Bad Giacomo is also joined by the final boss of sympathetic antagonists in the series, Ibrahim Ashik. Giacomo apparently had been blessing the rains down in Africa for the past few years before crossing the Med through Egypt back to Italy. And on his way, he picked up this guy as a right-hand man, or disciple of sorts. Ashik is an outsider, a highly educated young man who just came along for the ride because his life was a dead end. He sees Giacomo as creating a history he wants to be a part of. He's motivated, willing to die for a bunch of racist Italians, but he can be reasoned with, or maybe even convinced to let it go when the pivotal moment arrives. Alongside the reveal that Triella, with her wasted potential, is a vaguely North African refugee, the author is clearly trying to make a point, but what it is left as an exercise to the viewer. And now, all the pieces are in place for the climax, and what a hell of a climax it is.
Haters all around, finding in the heart and every waking sound.
You know what sucks? When an action series spends a long time setting up a whole ensemble cast of badass characters, gives them all time to establish what their skills are, and then never really escalates the action to where everyone really has to show what they're capable of. Not a problem that Gunslinger Girl has. The ending is an explosive affair which ties the series up in a nice bow. The action is cranked up another notch, and it means more than the girls all getting adorable chest rig and plate carrier setups. We've gone from skirmishes against Goombas with Glocks to a combined arms assault, the agency calling in drone strikes on militants with anti-materiel rifles and armored vehicles. So far I've been mostly skirting around spoilers for the manga, but I do really want to talk about the ending specifically. Skip to part 6 if you care about that sort of thing. The cyborgs have gone straight into an ambush, and Triella has gotten an arm and a leg blown off with 50 BMG. The bleeding has stopped as she drags herself around the basement of the nuclear power plant, but the repairs will fry her fading brain. Never mind the fire team of fully equipped 5 factions operatives bearing down on her. She won't be leaving here alive, but neither will they. Italy's terrorist alliance, the 5 factions, has taken their shot, simultaneous attacks all over the country. But Giacomo himself has taken over the Torino nuclear power plant and has challenged the social welfare agency in particular to come fight him. The government, realizing that the existence of the child soldier program would be a scandal even by the standards of Italian politics, sends them in, hoping that both sides will lose. What this means in practice is that everyone is here. Triella and Rico are stacking bodies, Henrietta is being psychotic, Petra is doing cool shit, and Sandro is rizzing. All the base bunnies are tooled up too. The Social Welfare Agency main offices are surrounded by a rogue paratrooper unit, serving a conspiracy trying to leverage the Prime Minister during the crisis. And the last line of defense is Clay's, who might not be completely retired. Things go poorly, a lot of people die, and the first-gen cyborgs are nearly terminal anyways. Something I've noticed is how the girls fall in some ironic echo of how they died the first time. Angelica was again hit by a car, in a manner of speaking, though this time she protects a father figure as opposed to being killed by them. Triella loses the same arm and leg, and is together with Hilscher at the end. Petra's cancer, which was caused by another notable incident at a nuclear power plant, was only in remission. Henrietta's final days and hours are marked with flashbacks to the destruction of her family, a phobia of men in masks, and it ends with her seeing Jose as her abuser and shooting him. It is left to the audience to determine how much of a hallucination that is. But Rico, who did not die before, just never lived, is the only one to leave unscathed. The story really sets you up to expect a maximally grim ending. The nuke goes off, the military moves in and executes the survivors, and given what the agency has been up to, they might have gotten what they deserved. Despite everything, however, Gunslinger Girl has no interest in crude nihilism and a fundamentally optimistic view on human nature. Ashik and Sandro's love for learning let the spy prevent the key from turning. Clay's half-remembering her old carbonary handler and breaking down in tears makes everyone uncomfortable enough that they call off the massacre. There's a literal deus ex machina as the Pope uses his spiritual authority to cool the broader violence around the country. Ueda is a papist. Disgusting. But the most surprising is Jean and Rico's showdown with Giacomo. It's quite a close-run thing. The terrorist has Jean as a human shield, but the latter manages to convince Rico to shoot them both with the 20 mic. Jean somehow survives at Rico's urging, and just when it looks like Giacomo is about to escape, he is apprehended by Julia, who was once a schoolmate of Enrica, the crochet little sister who was murdered by the man she now has at gunpoint. But Julia doesn't pull the trigger, despite Giacomo's urging and her own thirst for vengeance. She simply lets the military take him away. The saying goes that if you want revenge, dig 2 graves, but it seems you can dodge that if you resolve to fill neither. In caring for Rico, and with Giacomo still alive, Jean has broken the chain, found a reason to keep living besides revenge. It can be justified cynically. Giacomo is more useful as a show trial and bait than as a martyr. He has no magical ability to escape. But the real implications are moral. Since Jean didn't make the decision, it is strange, perhaps even undeserved, after all the brazenly extrajudicial and immoral things Jean and the agency has been up to, but they are all free of a violent fate. It helps that the Social Welfare Agency as a whole is dissolved, and all its surviving talent folded into the formal, legal security agencies. There's something reassuring in the way the social welfare agency, after a few mop-up operations, is treated as just another government black project, a gruesome wartime expedient to be hidden in the dustbin of history. There's no saccharine sequence of the girls saying goodbye, or even an insistence that the government is doing anything wrong in closing up shop. Clays did ride to the defense against the coup plotters, but that was in her interests, not those of the agency. Gunslinger Girl avoids the pitfall of making a setting rosy just because the viewer enjoys the series while it takes place there. The child soldier operation is an unpleasant place, and few are sad to see it go. In the background, Hilscher's girlfriend receives his final will and testament, the last details of how he met Triella, and the instructions to take Triella's ovum, removed during cyberization, and prevent the thread from being broken. The last chapter of the original run of the manga is about Triella's fostered daughter going to Hollywood and becoming the shining star her mother was always meant to be. It's a little silly, but it's cute. What really leaves more of an impression is chapter 100 of the volume release, with Clays gradually fading away after her rustication to her research ship, the last of the first-generation cyborgs. The other girls made the most of their final days, and so does she. It's not grim, it's melancholy, which is the best word to describe Gunslinger Girl as a whole.
In truth, there is no better place to be.
Did Gunslinger Girl deserve better? Deserve more attention? So far as the English-speaking world is concerned, I think so. The anime's index number on my anime list reveals it was among the first to be listed on the website. Yet, the Madhouse series sits at a 7.4 score, average for the site, and slowly declines year on year. What gets me is that it's easy to see why Gunslinger Girl wouldn't have a big audience. It's slow, alienating, and dated-looking, with an esoteric appeal. But some of its equally alienating, dated-looking, and esoteric contemporaries like Kino's Journey and Serial Experiments Lane are widely acknowledged cult classics. It's easy to see how Gunslinger Girl, with its title, premise, and aspirations, is not so obviously highbrow as those shows, but I don't think it's an order of magnitude less deserving, especially as the Madhouse anime sands the edges off the source material. Whatever else you might want to say about it, Gunslinger Girl is not quite like anything else out there. The way it weaves a ludicrous, fantastical premise together with a convincing facsimile of reality is what I've found in many of my favorite anime. You'll also find guns, terror, and transhumanism in something like Ghost in the Shell. But there is an emotional presence to Gunslinger Girl, a greater sense of what has been lost in becoming machines, a sense that the work they do has put the adults out in the cold. At the same time, it has an earnest positivity. The moral of the story seems to be that if you face your fears and are good to those who you care about, there will always be hope, and woe betide those who shirk that responsibility. It helps that, unlike a lot of series that are similarly thoughtful, Gunslinger Girl is also a thriller with some slick presentation and great action sequences. In terms of this kind of modern setting tactical action, I can only really name Aijin as a manga that manages to set up and play out gunfights in a more compelling way, and that didn't get a good anime adaptation. I feel like another series could come along and do what Gunslinger Girl did, but better. It is by no means a flawless package, and it could do without some baggage. But that show has yet to come along, and I think there is a lot to distinguish Gunslinger Girl from the rest or any potential successor. The tone that manages to be grim and grounded, but maintains a sense of optimism. The way the Italian setting, the politics thereof, the spycraft and the hardware, reveals Gunslinger Girl to be the product of a first-order otaku interest in real life, as opposed to merely aping some other genre fiction. At least among anime, it feels original and fresh, even to this day. I hope in the future I see more anime that feel equally original, or at least do a better job of copying Gunslinger Girl. Ciao.